Healthcare costs in the US are insane. Just listen to this.
Dialysis patients, there are about 500,000 of them. We actually spend, I think you know this, 1% of the federal budget on the dialysis program.
That's an incredible stat.
Not 1% of Medicare. 1% of the federal budget is the dialysis program.
That was Jetson leader Louise speaking on Bloomberg's Odd Lot podcast about how 1 out of every $100 that the federal government spends, or almost $70 billion per year, goes to 500,000 dialysis patients. Now, this is not to say that those patients shouldn't get the care that they need. I think that they should. But the fact that the government spends something like $140,000 per year on dialysis for each of those patients goes to show how expensive healthcare in this country really is, and it makes you wonder whether that money is being spent wisely or not. Actually, this is the type of question that the new Department of Government Efficiency headed by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy was created to address. I'll admit, when I first heard about DOGE, I was skeptical, and to some extent, I still am. But as I've learned more about how much money the government spends and what it spends the money on, it's become clear that there could be real benefits to shining a light on government spending. Let me play you another snippet from the podcast we listened to a second ago. In this clip, Jetson explains the massive amount of fraud that is associated with the dialysis program.
We do not, in general, pay for ambulance rides or taxi rides for these people to go to and from the visits. They are responsible for getting themselves to the clinic every day, 3 times a week generally, for a few hours, and that's in perpetuity. It's very challenging to get a kidney and therefore to get off of dialysis. So we had this system, and this is sort of the canonical Medicare fraud. We build in a little thing for the few people who need it, and that turns into a loophole through which bad actors drive a truck. So we built in this provision, which is if the only safe way that you can get to the dialysis clinic is in an ambulance, Medicare will pay for an ambulance. And they pay for it at a competitive rate for the ambulance companies at, say, $250 for a one-way ride. Now, that's not that much money for a real ambulance, but it's a heck of a lot of money for a taxi. And what happened is thousands of firms around the country opened with the express intention not of giving people serious medical care, but of becoming an expensive ambulance taxi. And billed the government. We have 100% data from the dialysis system. We can see all of these payments, more than $7 billion for non-emergency ambulance transportation over the following 10 years. $7.7 billion. And a lot of it was fraud. And the government cracked down. The government really tried to crack down. And in particular, they used a number of tools. The first one is they started throwing people in prison. This is what you see in the headlines.
Yeah.
But it's so easy to start an ambulance company that we'd see these stories where, you know, someone gets busted and their family member goes and opens a company next door the next day. And this persisted for years with thousands of companies and billions of dollars of spending just down the drain.
Wow, so that is some pretty eye-opening stuff. And this is just one example of fraudsters taking advantage of the federal government to the tune of billions of dollars. Jetson says that there's many other examples of widespread fraud in the healthcare industry, and that by reducing this fraud, the government can save as much as $100 billion. Not only that, he says if this same scrutiny is applied to other categories of government expenditures, like defense spending, there could be additional savings of tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars. Now, Jetson isn't the only one saying this. The U.S. Government Accountability Office, which is the federal agency responsible for auditing government spending, estimates that the federal government could be losing as much as $521 billion per year because of fraud, and over $200 billion per year due to improper payments, which is when the government accidentally sends money to someone it's not supposed to send money to. If Jetson and the Accountability Office are right, then that's a big opportunity for Elon and Vivek's Department of Government Efficiency. In a recent op-ed on the Wall Street Journal, the duo wrote that they would find a way for President Trump to cut government spending dramatically by rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government. So the fraud that Jetson and the Government Accountability Office identified is exactly the type of thing that DOGE is seeking to eliminate. That said, Elon and Vivek are targeting much more than just fraud. They've said that they also want to dramatically reduce the federal government workforce and cut expenditures that aren't explicitly authorized by Congress, like grants to international organizations and to Planned Parenthood. Those are obviously more controversial things that you may or may not agree with. But regardless, there does seem to be the potential to reduce government spending significantly in ways that almost everyone agrees on, like rooting out fraud and cutting out waste. And that's interesting to me because my initial initial assumption was that it would be impossible to move the needle on government spending without drastic reductions in entitlement programs. If you look at what the federal government spends money on today, of the $6.75 trillion of total spending, over 60% of it is mandatory. That is, it's required to be spent based on existing laws. This is spending on things like Social Security and Medicare. Another 13% is spent on interest on the national debt, which also must be paid. That leaves another bucket called discretionary spending, and that includes expenditures on national defense, education, transportation, and other programs that Congress approves through annual appropriations bills. Of this discretionary spending budget, defense makes up around half of it. And as you probably know, most people don't want to touch defense spending. It's a political landmine. So my thought was, unless the government made tough choices by cutting Social Security or Medicare benefits, you couldn't reduce government expenditures significantly. There just wasn't enough meat in that non-defense discretionary spending bucket to make a difference. But it turns out the government can potentially save a bunch of money without touching Social Security, Medicare, or any of that. And that's a good thing. Of course, just tackling fraud and waste might not be enough if you're worried about runaway government deficits. Cutting a few $100 billion of government spending is great, but the US federal government now spends nearly $1 trillion a year just on interest on the national debt. And if the current trajectory persists, that amount is just going to get bigger, which could lead to a fiscal crisis down the line if nothing is done about it. So if we want to address that, maybe more drastic actions must be taken, like reforming entitlement programs or even raising taxes. That's a related but different topic. The point of this video is there's an opportunity to save a lot of money by making the government more efficient. And that's a worthy goal that could have a positive impact on the US economy broadly. After all, federal government spending represents around a quarter of US GDP. Making the government more efficient makes our entire economy more efficient. This is particularly true in the healthcare industry, where the government plays a major role through the Medicare and Medicaid programs. The US spends around $4.5 trillion or $13,500 per person on healthcare per year. The federal government accounts for a third of that spending. So to the extent those dollars can be used more efficiently, the economy will be better off. Granted, there's probably a limit to how efficient you can make the government. Incentives in the public sector are different than they are in the private sector. The government is never going to operate like a private company, nor should it. Not to mention, identifying and rooting out fraud and waste is easier said than done. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. The Government Accountability Office and the more than 70 inspectors general who work in federal government agencies have thousands of open recommendations for how to improve the government's performance. They say that those recommendations could quickly be implemented, saving the government hundreds of billions of dollars. Given Elon and Vivek have close ties with Trump, they could help push these recommendations through, as well as come up with their own solutions to reform government spending. On the other hand, Elon and Vivek aren't necessarily neutral parties in all of this. They have a political point of view that you might not agree with, so you might take issue with their approach. Maybe they want to cut government spending much more than you're comfortable with, or they want to cut things that you don't want to be cut. That's completely fair. But regardless of whether you support the exact methods that they're proposing, it's still encouraging to see the topic of government efficiency become so prominent. Cutting things like waste and fraud in government is a bipartisan issue, and now that it's out in the open, both parties can address it in the way they see fit. So we'll see what happens. Elon and Vivek have said that they intend to complete their work and shut down DOGE by July 4th, 2026, so about a year and a half from now. It'll be interesting to see how much they can accomplish in that relatively short period of time. Anyway, let me know in the comments whether you think they're going to be successful or not. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.